And we're recording. So let me see. At our last lecture, that was the one where we didn't have slides because the roof leak had destroyed the computer. I did upload the slides that I would have given. So hopefully everybody's got access to those and has brushed up a little bit. But I want to finish today talking about global ocean current patterns. And as we talked about this in the very first lecture, I think, one of the global patterns of circulation in the oceans is that at the poles, uh, when where it's very cold, water freezes, and when sea ice forms, the water that freezes is almost pure, and that means the water that's left behind is extra salty. The salt is locked out of the forming ice crystals, and it's also extremely cold, which makes it very dense, which means it sinks downwards. And that sets up an extremely slow vertical circulation pattern called thermohaline circulation. And that's very slow. It might take a given water molecule thousands of years to go from the poles down to the depths and then ultimately back to the surface. What we talked about on Friday was what sets up the global pattern of prevailing winds is ultimately the heating of the earth, creating those convection cells, and then those convection cells getting deflected by the Coriolis effect, the Coriolis force, deflecting them counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere. And the surface winds, in turn, push ocean water around. But thanks to an interplay between the Coriolis effect and the cohesion of water, surface winds push water around at a net direction that's at right angles to the direction that they're blowing. That's called Ekman transport. It's a little counterintuitive. And thanks to Ekman transport, wherever you have winds that are parallel to a coastline, water gets pushed away from the coastline, and that creates another mode of vertical ocean circulation called upwelling. That matters because zones of upwelling are some of the world's most productive fisheries, because that upwelling water that's being dragged up from below by water being pushed away, that deep water that's getting pulled up is not only cold, it's also rich in nutrients. So that feeds blooms of algae, which feeds blooms of zooplankton, little tiny shrimp and fish larvae and things like that. Those go on to feed bigger fish, which go on to feed even bigger fish. So upwelling is extremely important from an economic point of view. And then finally, what we haven't covered is we did mention that winds tend to drive ocean currents at right angles to the prevailing wind direction. The only problem with this is that sometimes the continents get in the way, and in each major ocean, surface winds tend to drive surface currents around in circular patterns that span the entire ocean, and those circular patterns are called gyres. Think of gyroscope, gyrate. It's a Latin word meaning to turn. And there's the 5 main gyres on the planet. Let me get my laser pointer out. The North Atlantic gyre in the North Atlantic Ocean. Water in the North Atlantic just sloshing around and round from the east coast of the US all the way to the Atlantic coast of Southern Europe and Africa, and then back around again. The South Atlantic gyre in the South Atlantic, obviously, cycling back and forth between South Africa across the Atlantic to the east coast of South America, Brazil, and then coming back around. the North Pacific Gyre over here in the North Pacific, the South Pacific Gyre in the South Pacific, and the Indian Ocean Gyre right there. The question was asked, is gyres formed due to the influence of continents? Well, what's pushing the water is prevailing winds. And if we didn't have any continents, water would just circulate around and around and around the entire Earth. But because the continents are in the way, is why the gyres are ultimately have the size that they do. Let me get back to that in just a second. That's actually a useful point to make. One of the things that the gyres do is transport water of varying temperatures. And an example we'll be talking about in much greater detail, this side of the North Atlantic gyre has another name right up here. That side of the North Atlantic gyre is called the Gulf Stream. And one major effect that we'll be looking at later in a bit is that it transports warm water and just warm thermal energy in general northward across the Atlantic. And it's the reason why Great Britain and Ireland, and I guess the Atlantic coast of France, have a milder climate than you would expect that they would. On the flip side over here, the North Pacific Gyre, this extension of it right there is called the California Current. And that takes cold water from the North Pacific, brings it across the ocean and down into contact with the California coast. And this is why the climate of central and northern California is quite a bit cooler than some people expect. I've talked to people who think that the climate in California is basically all palm trees and warm oceans and surfing and things like that. Northern California, it gets cold. Mark Twain famously said the coldest winter he ever spent was the summer in San Francisco. And having lived there for a while, I can tell you he's right. It doesn't really freeze, but it can get very chilly in the mornings, very foggy and very drab, and you really don't want to swim for long in that water without a wetsuit. So climates in general in different parts of the world, and certainly the type of water that you find and different types of living things are influenced very strongly by these gyres transporting masses of warm or cold water to different parts of the world. And I think in a later lecture, when I look at faunal provinces, I'll be able to show you in more detail how that plays out with regard to marine life. Okay, so there's a map of the prevailing North Atlantic gyre, water going round and around and around. And as we've said, the western side of the gyre, this flow, is the Gulf Stream. And it's an example of what we call a boundary current, which is a current that is basically present where it is and directed where it is by the presence of a continental edge. If the United States was suddenly missing, we wouldn't have a Gulf Stream. I'd have to map out exactly what would go on, but we wouldn't have that Gulf Stream in the place where we do. Incidentally, you'll notice that in the middle of the North Atlantic gyre, there's this area called the Sargasso Sea. In the center of the gyres, you don't have very strong current flow at all. The current is strongest on the rim, and in the center of the gyres, not a whole lot may be happening. And in the Sargasso Sea, there's not much current motion, and there's not an awful lot of land. I mean, you've got the islands of Bermuda, and that may be it. You don't have any land, I don't think. And what dominates in the water is species of brown algae in the genus Sargassum that are specialized to permanently float. They build up in the center of the Sargasso Sea. They're not really carried anywhere because there aren't really strong prevailing currents. So algae just grows here in the center of the gyre. And it's really cool because there's an entire ecosystem of animal species that spend their entire lives living on these sargassum clumps. So this, for example, is a very nicely camouflaged frogfish in the genus Histrio. And you can see it's got almost exactly the same color as the sargassum weed and a very similar texture in its fins to the shape of the sargassum blades. And there is a sizable number of animal species, fish and shrimp and various invertebrates that live only on these floating sargassum clumps. And the reason why you get this rich ecosystem is ultimately because of, it's in the center of a gyre. So yeah, there we go. There's our cute marine organism for the day. Anyway, worse things than seaweed can build up in the calm waters inside gyres. This dead seabird, if you look carefully, you'll notice that its body cavity is packed full of pieces of plastic. The center of the North Pacific gyre has built up a very large collection of floating plastic waste that's washed into the ocean from the countries surrounding the North Pacific and been carried by the currents and ultimately just drifted into the middle. That's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Much of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch isn't macroscopic plastic anymore. The plastics have been broken into tiny pieces by the weathering effect of sun and water. But tiny fragments of plastic, even if they're microscopic in size, still pose a problem for sea life because those tiny fragments of plastic are almost exactly the same size as the microscopic animals that many species of fish depend on. So if you have a fish that's trying to feed, it feeds on transparent floating things, and those might be life forms, but now there's fragments of plastic now outnumber the plankton that the fish is feeding on by a factor of 6 to 1. And obviously, eating pieces of plastic is not nutritious. The fish can't grow. Some of that plastic has hormone disruptors in it. It's a bit of a problem. But that Great Pacific Garbage Patch is located where it's located because it's in the middle of the North Pacific Gyre in the calm water, and it can't really get flushed away anywhere. So we'll go back to the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a western boundary current, and western boundary currents tend to transport warm water into colder latitudes. The Gulf Stream is one of them. If we go back, you can see there's several others. There's a western boundary current here that carries warm Pacific water from equatorial latitudes up past the country of Japan. That particular one happens to be called the Kuroshio. Sorry, I cannot write very well. You can see there is another western boundary current right here, bringing equatorial warm water southward to New Zealand. And there's one here that is, I've just forgotten what that one is called. And you've got one here, western boundary currents. They're on the western side of these gyres, which often means they're on the east side of a continent, and they tend to bring warm water north. So this is a satellite image where ocean temperatures have been measured and colorized. The warmest water is this dark red, and then progressively cooler waters are yellow, green, and blue. And you can see the Gulf Stream. It's got some swirls in it, uh, running up along the North American coast all the way to here, Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, where it breaks away from the continent and starts crossing the ocean. Another way of looking at it, I can't remember, this might have been the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, government agency. They dropped a bunch of buoys with satellite transponders, and each buoy sent data on its location to a satellite, including data on what direction it was moving. So every one of these little dots is the location of a free-floating buoy, and it's been color-coded with respect to what direction it was moving in. So a buoy that's going north is represented by a chain of dots that's dark blue. A buoy going south is represented by a chain of dots that's red. And a buoy going east is represented by light blue dots. And you can see the Gulf Stream very well. If you look here, this would be more or less in the middle of the Sargasso Sea. You can see there's really no prevailing direction. You can see buoys that were going north, south, east, and west, and they're all about equally frequent. But here you've got this very strong directional pattern right there, and that's just the Gulf Stream. So that's just another way of recognizing it. And here we've got more of those western boundary currents again. You've seen this slide before. This is a global average rainfall, and you can see we've got that big rainy zone right along the equator. That's the itch, the intertropical convergence zone, right there, ITCZ. There, at least I can draw that clearly. And you've seen the 30-degree belts of desert. We talked about that. But a bit of a complication to this is created by these western boundary currents, because as warm water moves northward up here, that's the Gulf Stream, that warm water warms the air above it. And as the air above the Gulf Stream gets warm, the warm air can carry more moisture. Warm air can carry more moisture than cold air. This is why your lips might chap when it gets really cold. If the air is really cold, it's also really dry. You have similar phenomena happening in the South Atlantic right there. What the heck? Let me draw that. So I have this western boundary current. We have, let's see, which way is it going? There, we've got that equatorial zone right there. We've got that right there. And we have this big one right here. This is the position of the Kuroshio current, which brings not just warm air, but very moist air to places like southern Japan. We've got another one right here. So this is very typical for western boundary currents. Incidentally, eastern boundary currents, because that's cold water moving towards the equator, they don't tend to bring moisture, but they're often important zones of upwelling. So the California current does this. And I mentioned that it makes the climate surprisingly cool in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California of the US, but it also makes for a big upwelling zone centered around Monterey. The Benguelas current is the one that does this, and that's an eastern boundary current, and that sets up a big zone of upwelling right there in southern Africa. The Canary Current in the North Atlantic does that. And that certainly doesn't bring moisture, but it does set up a major upwelling zone there, and so on. So the eastern side of these gyres, often you've got upwelling, and often you have very rich fisheries. Okay, yes, western boundary currents may not bring upwelling, but a western boundary current is taking warm water, moving it northwards or moving it polewards, moving it towards the poles. That warm water heats the air, and the warm air carries moisture and then ultimately drops it. So, yeah, western boundary currents tend to bring moisture and warmer temperatures. Eastern boundary currents don't particularly bring moisture, but they they often bring upwelling where they're located. Oh, minor historical footnote. Benjamin Franklin is usually kind of written off in American history books as the weirdo who flew a kite in a thunderstorm. Ben Franklin was actually one of the best scientists in the world at the time, at least in the European dominated world. For example, the reason why you call the thing that you put in your electronics to make them go a battery is Franklin's coinage. He came up with terms like battery, positive, negative. He was a diplomat in France during the time of the Revolutionary War, and he made a lot of contacts in French society because he had a very good reputation as an excellent scientist. And so he corresponded with people like Coulomb and Ampere and people like that. He also was not the discoverer of the Gulf Stream, but he studied the Gulf Stream intensely. He drew a map of it, and he proposed that it would be useful to ships because ship captains had already noticed that it took much less time to travel from the American colonies to England than it took to go from England to the American colonies. Because if you went from England to the American colonies, you have to fight against the Gulf Stream. Whereas if you're going from the colonies to England, you're riding the Gulf Stream. So there. So the Gulf Stream makes the climate and the sea temperatures around Britain and Ireland down there quite a bit warmer than they would ordinarily be. Britain and Ireland are at the same latitude as, central Canada. We're at the same latitude as, central Manitoba or something like that, which gets bitterly cold in winter. Britain's got a much milder climate because of the moderating effect of the Gulf Stream, bringing all of that heat energy northwards. And the Gulf Stream continues beyond. You can see there's an extension of it that's labeled the Norwegian Current that goes up here, up the coast of Norway. It means that all the way up here at the Lofoten Islands, you still have ports that are free of sea ice most of the year. So the climate in Norway is quite a bit milder than it would ordinarily be. And so is the climate of Iceland. I mean, Iceland is still bad, but it is much more livable than it would be if there wasn't any current. And those northern extensions are collectively called the North Atlantic Drift. And the North Atlantic Drift is where it is because it's literally being pulled there, because the North Atlantic is where two of the big global gears meet. The North Atlantic Drift, you have thermohaline circulation taking cold water and making it sink. You can't dig a hole in the ocean. So if cold water is sinking, water has to come from the surface to replace the cold water that's sinking down. And where it comes from is it's this warm water that's getting literally pulled into position by the thermohaline circulation. It's warm water that's ultimately coming from the Gulf Stream that's part of this North Atlantic Drift. So right here, these blue um, little dots with X's in them, there and there, those are the points where warmer water from the North Atlantic drift is pulled north, is chilled, and ultimately drops down. And these pink dots with the X's right there and there, those are the major places where bottom water finally is pulled back up, where thermohaline circulation finally bobs back to the surface. So right there in the North Atlantic, again, I keep thinking of the meeting of two gears. You have the surface pattern of circulation, which is being driven by prevailing winds, but part of that gets pulled up into the north and replaces the cold water that's sunk down. So this is where the surface pattern of circulation meshes with that very slow, very deep thermohaline circulation. You know, it's all connected. And little historical footnote right there. The North Atlantic drift moderates the climate from Scotland, Norway, and all the way to North Russia. Right up here, let me see, where the heck is it? Yeah, right there. There's a port in North Russia called Murmansk. Right there, incidentally, there's another port city called Arkhangelsk, which I've been to a very long time ago. Murmansk, in particular, is far above the Arctic Circle, but because of the North Atlantic drift, the ocean doesn't freeze, and you can use the port all year round. And the same is true for that slightly southern port called Arkhangelsk. And that's one of the things that made it possible for the UK and the United States to ship enormous amounts of supplies to the Soviet Union during the Second World War. We sent them motorized vehicles. We sent them tanks. So did the British. We sent food. We sent gasoline. And I mean, it was pretty miserable work because you had to sail all the way above the Arctic Circle and all the way around. And of course, there was always the chance that German submarines would sink you. But what made it possible to do that at all was the fact that the North Atlantic drift makes the climate mild enough that the ocean didn't freeze over, at least not for most of the year. Murmansk might have been impossible in the deep winter. I think Arkhangelsk is usable year round. And what kept those ports from being just completely iced over constantly is the North Atlantic drift. So it was the North Atlantic drift that helped win the war against Nazism and win the war for the Allies. So there, I like little historical notes like this. A rough estimate of the amount of energy carried north of 24 degrees latitude, that should say latitude, not Celsius. I was clearly not thinking there, is almost 15 quadrillion watts, which is an awful lot. That is an amount of power comparable to the amount of power that a large and prosperous country would use in a year. I haven't done all of the math, but that is on an order of magnitude comparable to what the United States generates in a year. You know, that's a huge amount of thermal energy that gets carried north of 24 degrees north latitude. This sets up what may seem like a paradox. One of the things that we're worried about in this era of climate change that we're in is thermohaline circulation is driven by the freezing of sea ice, right? When ice freezes in the Arctic, the water that goes into the ice is nearly pure, and what's left behind is dense saline water that sinks down. That means that things are going to get weird if we stop making sea ice in the Arctic. And in fact, we've seen serious declines in the amount of sea ice produced each year. And if we don't produce sea ice anymore, thermohaline circulation would shut down, which gets potentially really bad because in times in Earth's past history when we haven't had thermohaline circulation, there's evidence from the rock record for massive anoxia, loss of oxygen in the deep ocean, and that's going to mess with, among other things, with fisheries quite a lot. But if we shut down thermohaline circulation, we also shut down the North Atlantic drift. And while most of the world would be warming up under that scenario, shutting down thermohaline circulation and no longer pulling that warm water northwards would make the North Atlantic colder. So most of the world would warm up, but the UK and Norway up here, we're talking average mean temperatures that look to be between, 2.5 to 5 to maybe as much as 10 degrees Celsius below their historic averages. So something, not that you need more things to worry about in your life, but if you want to add one to your collection, that is one. And what would shut down thermohaline circulation would be no more production of sea ice and the melting of existing ice sheets, like this ice sheet that covers the island of Greenland. Greenland is almost entirely covered by sheets of ice. That's what you have here on the left. And we're already starting to see retreat of the Greenland ice sheet. And if it melts significantly, it's going to release large amounts of fresh water into the North Atlantic. That means sea level rise. It also means we don't get that salty water that's sinking down. So that means no thermohaline circulation. And that means most of the world getting warmer, but Northern Europe getting significantly colder. Be interesting to see how that plays out. Right. I will now stop the recording, and once I've stopped, you can cuss.